Hey everybody, this is Brian Young on episode number 65 of Origin Stories on Creativity. I spoke to a woman from South Africa named Leonie Joubert. This is somebody that probably shouldn't have been on my show. We're talking about a journalist from Cape Town who is a graduate of Rhodes University with a master's in journalism from Stellenbosch. She's written several books. Her work includes Scorched, Boiling Point, Invaded, The Hungry Season. She's currently working on a piece about a 65-year-old woman or so who has been arrested for attempting to work on therapeutic psychedelic medicines. Not unlike the VA and their work with MDMA in treating soldiers coming back from war with PTSD. I mean, there's been marvelous breakthroughs with that drug and soldiers with that affliction. I had a wonderful conversation talking with her, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed listening to her. She has a great way of talking. She comes from a country that struggles with laws preventing people from taking medicine, basically. America, United States of America anyway, is attempting to liberalize a lot of these laws that are putting people in prisons when they shouldn't be. And her country is doing the same thing. And I hope for the best out there with her plight and with her people in South Africa's plight. And, with no further ado, here is Leonie Joubert.
I'm happy to talk with you about my own experience of having tried acid and tried mushrooms and why I absolutely adore mushrooms and won't touch acid.
You're from South Africa. You're from
Correct.
Cape Town.
Yeah.
And I listened to a portion of one of your podcasts, which, man, I have to tell you, the production quality of your work is absolutely stunning. It really is amazing. You blow me away in terms of what you're
Wow.
producing. It sounds like, well, obviously, this is kind of like a soup sandwich here. We just kind of talk about whatever comes up. But
Yeah.
your production quality is really stunning.
Sure.
You talk.
Yeah, thank you. I'm blown away to hear that. I literally just started experimenting about 3 months ago, so I'm a complete rookie.
Oh,
I've been writing stories for 17 years, but I've never tried to record them for a listener. So I haven't, this is interesting. You might find this interesting as a storyteller. I've been writing this sort of material for 17 years, and I have never in all those years felt as vulnerable as I have on this project
well,
because
it's
it's
your
what
voice, isn't it? I mean, in terms of,
it
well, I don't know what.
is.
Yeah.
There's something removed about having your printed words on someone else's page, but when it's your voice delivering the story, it suddenly becomes very real, and I felt more exposed than ever. It's quite interesting that
How long did it take you to get used to it, or have you yet?
I'm still getting used to it. I'm still getting used to
I've
it.
heard you do get used to it. In fact, when I first started, it was the same for me. I couldn't stand it. I was having a really hard time with the editorial process, going back in and trimming it down. And you sound so nasally and it's so horrible. And, you notice the ums and the ahs, and I'll go back in and I'll trim the intro. I'll cut all the ums and the ahs out of it because that's what I make. I'll, have those verbal tics where I pause and try to think about what I'm doing next, and I'll trim those right out. Really trying hard to avoid those.
Yeah, but you have a really great voice for audio. There's this lovely kind of deep sort of rumbling to your voice, which sounds really comforting, actually. It's interesting.
To my mother's chagrin, I used to smoke, so I think that's what I think that's where it comes from. So, yeah, in terms of past usage, and in terms of, people that that use now, uh, past usage of psychedelics, I was never a fan of acid. I used it a couple of times, makes me incredibly anxious. It makes me think about things in the moment that make me not happy. And
Okay.
you said the same. You don't like the idea
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
that.
Well,
Oh no,
would you
that's not where I
like?
wanted to start
Oh,
this conversation.
oh,
Actually, I wanted to
it's fine.
start. Sorry, I got lost. Cape Town in
It's
South
fine.
Africa. And your
Yeah.
podcast being a wonderful production.
Thank
South
you.
Africa itself is filled with violence, filled with this tension. Right? I mean, I was watching a video
Yeah.
of a woman getting ready to go into her house, and she was very, very anxious, and she was looking over her shoulder all the time, and she was watching this other car kind of slowly pull up behind her, and she
Mhm.
was watching it. She was getting her keys out and she was getting ready to go into her home, and this car was pulling up, and she was like, what's going to happen? And she was slowly putting her keys into the lock, and these men got out of the car, and at the moment that she was about to go into her door, she changed her mind and got into her car instead, and they attacked her car, and she sped backwards
Mhm.
and blah blah blah. And looking into the comments of that video, they were starting to explain, they were going to kidnap her and hold her for ransom. And everybody in
Mhm.
South Africa kind of gets these trainings of how to drive defensively, because she had driven backwards for 200 yards as she was being chased by these men or whatever. And the podcast that I listened to, you talked about how ayahuasca and psilocybin kind of
Mhm.
helps with trauma and
Yeah.
whatnot. And I guess, being from South Africa, do you feel, I mean, especially with the legalities of the drug, is that a correct term? The drug,
Yeah. Drugs a good word. Yeah.
therapeutic medicine almost in a way, right? I mean, it can be
Yeah.
used like that. It would be so
Yeah.
beneficial on a societal
Yeah.
level.
So what the interesting thing that I'm trying to do with this podcast, and you're absolutely right. South Africa is an incredibly violent, very traumatized society, and it's got to do with sort of 300 years of very exploitative colonial practice and apartheid, which was like the kind of segregation you had in the States 50 years ago.
Mm.
And various reasons. We have excessively high levels of poverty, lots of informal settlements, and huge amounts of violence and crime, particularly in these very poor communities. If this can give you an indication of the state of affairs, there was a research study done in an informal settlement, a small sort of slum environment outside Johannesburg recently. And the researchers wanted to understand the extent of gender-based domestic violence. And they interviewed almost 2,000 men, and over 50% of those men said that in the previous year they had raped or sexually assaulted a woman.
Oh my
And
God, what percentage was it?
over 50%.
Oh my God, that's incredible.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we're worried about Harvey Weinstein in this country, who,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
I think we should be worried about, and those type of situations. I guess is where it starts. Or
Yeah, and now the interesting thing is that these researchers then wanted to try and track back what the origin of that excessive level of violence might be, and they found in most cases the men who went on to become so violent had been abused and traumatized as children. Now, I don't just mean sort of sexually violated or physically violated, but exposed to a context where there's constant stress and deprivation. So the kind of think of it as a passive violence of neglect, a passive violence of not having access to food, of constantly being afraid that you're going to be mugged on the way to the local shop. In many cases, these are communities where people have to use outside toilets because they don't have running water in their homes. And, they'll get mugged and knifed on the way to the toilet in the middle of the night. It's that kind of
mm,
constant level of stress that results in such dysfunctional adulthood. So what I was fascinated with, and I kind of stumbled upon the story about the reemergence of psychedelic psychiatry. I stumbled on it a few years ago. And what fascinated me was seeing how much work is being done with some of these psychedelics by communities in the US, where you have war veterans who are profoundly traumatized. They go away on these kind of ayahuasca retreats or similar retreats, and they have a few dosing sessions with this hallucinogenic brew, and they have incredible breakthroughs in terms of dealing with their stress and their trauma. And then at the same time, You have clinical research trials being done at places like Johns Hopkins University, at Imperial College London, University of New Mexico. These are people who are in a clinical setting taking in war veterans or people with treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant PTSD, alcoholism, and they're putting these people through literally just a 12-week program where the bulk of the program is ordinary talk therapy. And this talk therapy prepares them for and then helps them later integrate just 2 dosing sessions where they take this hallucinogenic drug. And in many cases, the benefits of those 2 dosing sessions are still witnessed months and months later, long after the substance has left the body. Anyway, so what I try to do with this podcast is bring together the experiences that I'm hearing about from the military veteran community, the experiences coming from these clinical research conditions, and looking at how psychedelics work, and then trying to propose a model for how to bring that kind of very powerful medical intervention into communities like this in South Africa, where people are desperately poor. The public mental health care system is completely absent from their lives. They have no option of counseling or therapy or anything like that. So I'm trying to kind of show I'm trying to show the potential of that as a really legitimate medical intervention. So, this isn't just a bunch of sort of middle-class hippies trying to get the recreational drug of choice available in South Africa.
The interesting thing to me is that you have this situation where you take a soldier who might have experienced 1 year of trauma or 2 years of trauma, or in the American situation where an Iraqi veteran might go back 9 times in his career or something along those lines, and you kind of cross that with somebody who spent a lifetime of trauma, moving through the ranks of violence, and you have to remove them from that, but then you put them right back into it. And they still have to struggle in the same kind of violence, or they're going to die. And that kind of suffering doesn't get alleviated no matter how much therapeutic hallucinogen you give them. And then you also have the idea of the soldiers, an educated individual. They have to graduate some kind of schooling. Even if they do drop out in high school, they're educated in the military situation. They have discipline. You put that to the poverty-stricken individual who's educated on the street. They know how to survive the poverty by violence. You know what I mean? That's the drugs, the therapy is not going to take that away from them. They still have to go back into that to survive, or they die.
No, you're absolutely right. One of the things though that comes through, interestingly enough, in one of the interviews with the guys who run an organization called Vets for Entheogenic Therapy. So this organization, they're taking war vets down to Costa Rica or Peru or somewhere on ayahuasca retreats. And what's interesting is they say that with most of these guys, so these are really traumatized veterans, when they go down on these retreats, they don't end up dealing with their war trauma. They actually end up dealing with their childhood trauma. And the theory that these guys are developing is that, of all the guys, all the men and women who go off to the Middle East to fight, a percentage of them come back with this very severe PTSD. And the theory is that it's the ones who have troubled and traumatized childhoods who are the ones who are least resilient once they become adults and more likely to become ill. And the message for all of us is that for every society, you don't have to go off to war to develop PTSD. If you have had a childhood that hasn't been secure and safe and connected and loving, the chances are you might very well be vulnerable to all sorts of mood disorders and addictions as an adult. And it just shows how potentially powerful these substances are as a point of intervention. And you're absolutely right. For someone living in an informal settlement where there's so much perpetual poverty and violence around them, it's not like these drugs are suddenly going to change the system that they operate in. But it might be able to just dial back a little bit on that rage. These are young people who have little education, no job prospects, deep poverty, and a sense of existential impotence, that they have no agency over their lives. And this can kind of just temper that anger a little bit. And then you plug it into all sorts of other sort of societal and community interventions that help, learn skills and create jobs and integrate.
You know what it might help is if we give some ayahuasca therapy to the opposite end of the extreme, drop it in some politician's coffee, loosen up that tie a little bit.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So one thing I should have said right at the beginning to maybe frame this better for your listeners, here in South Africa, we're pretty conservative around these kinds of substances. I mean, when I listen to a lot of the American and European podcasts that deal with similar conversation or similar topics, I mean, you guys are just so open about it. You know, the genie is out of the bottle over there, but here we're still very, very conservative. And what's going to happen
Something you can't even use it. Like you can't verbally and be free about it at all. Like you can't say
no.
I smoked a J or whatever. They'll come to knock on your door and arrest you. Is that the situation?
Well, it's not that bad, but you know, you want to keep your head you want to keep your head down. But I think with the more important implication is that we have an interesting court case that is going to happen next year.
Mm-hmm.
The background is that a woman who is now aged 73, the most ordinary grandmotherly looking type person you've ever met in an ordinary middle class suburb, was arrested a while ago because she hosts what we call here these mushroom ceremonies. They like the ayahuasca retreats. Anyway,
Ayahuasca is interesting because I thought you could only find that in South America.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can get ayahuasca here in South Africa. I don't know whether they grow the plants here or whether they manage to smuggle them in somehow.
It's not a mushroom,
I think,
right?
no,
Is it?
it's ayahuasca is a like a brew, a hot sort of tea-like brew that's made from two plants that are indigenous to the Andes. And they grow in tropical kind of conditions. And I suspect that these plants are grown at places in South Africa, because I know there are lots of ayahuasca retreats. And, you know, often they'll bring the shamans out from Peru or Costa Rica, but I think the plants, they do grow them here. Similarly with mushrooms, you know, the mushrooms you buy on the street here are all sort of locally cultivated.
Trying to pull up your email because there's no way I'll be able to spell ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca. It's
Just like I do at
A-Y.
Google.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so these mushroom journeys are very similar to the ayahuasca retreats. So people will get together in the journey guide's home, usually in the evening. You will have fasted for a few days beforehand, cutting out on alcohol and cannabis and meat. And then you take 5 grams of powdered mushrooms, which is a lot. They call that a hero's dose. And literally within 15 minutes, it's as if your body melts and just dissolves, and what is left is just kind of this incredible consciousness. And it's almost like standing in a dark room where you're just surrounded by incredible pulsing lights and incredible music. They always have music playing. That's a very important component. And then, yeah, you just follow these incredible thought processes. It's quite remarkable. But anyway, the point is a lot of people in the small subculture in South Africa do these mushroom journeys as a way of either managing depression and anxiety and existential stuff, or else they do it for self-actualization and spiritual advancement and whatever. But this woman was arrested for hosting these ceremonies, and she was charged with possession and dealing of a Schedule 7 substance, which is the equivalent of a Schedule 1 in the States. So basically, that was like being arrested for having heroin or crystal meth in her home.
And there's no addictive properties to this drug at all. I mean, in fact, I think there's been studies saying that they actually help addictions.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the remarkable thing, is that they are being the early research around the potential of substances like hallucinogenic mushrooms, psilocybin, and ayahuasca and LSD. I mean, very, very effective for treating mood disorders. Addictions like alcoholism. I mean, the current prescription medication for treating alcoholism and nicotine dependence appear to be significantly less successful than just 2 or 3 dosing sessions of psilocybin. I mean, that's how remarkable. And, you know, once you've experienced a psychedelic journey, you realize that it's often, it's profound, but it's often not fun. You know, it's a very, very intense experience. It's not something you want to jump into every other night when you feel like self-medicating because you're stressed after a day at work. You know, it's hard work, those journeys. So, you know, unfortunately, and I think this is what you're alluding to, unfortunately, there's this perception that because psychedelics are lumped into the same sort of illegal category as heroin or crystal meth, that they work on the body in the same way, and that they are equally dangerous, equally addictive, you know, equally harmful, whatever. And it's just not the case. I mean, there's just a mountain of evidence to show that that's not the case. And the reason these drugs were banned in the 1970s by the United Nations was because there was this this political and ideological backlash against a bunch of hippies who didn't want to go and fight in Vietnam.
And you know what's really interesting to me is that, well, one of the reasons I aim to have, well, somebody who spoke so eloquently about psychedelics come on and speak with me is the ideas behind the community of psychedelics, mainly like a Terence McKenna type situation, the stoned monkey, which is I wrote to you in an email, ideas where psychedelics kind of came into the forming of what we know of as society and things of that nature. And that they were banned in the 70s after the Cultural Revolution. And then after the 70s, what happened was the Cultural Revolution kind of went away. It's very interesting how that kind of destroyed the whole 60s vibe of what was it that the 60s was kind of trying to aim for? The anti-establishmentarianism of the hippie movement.
Yeah, the kind of beatniks, the make love not war crowd. And you know, it's terribly sad. I mean, when you think at when you look at how exposure to psychedelics transforms people, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment. It literally it teaches people how to love and empathize. And I've heard the most remarkable stories and experienced the most remarkable transformation myself through exposure to these substances. That, you know, the world would be a better place if you know, if we were using these substances instead of alcohol.
I'll add that the world became a better place. You know, what did McKenna said? I mean, he's not a very widely appreciated individual, but 100,000 years ago, we were monkeys living very far apart, and we started using these mushrooms, and we became together through sex and food and community, and we have what we have: New York City and, you know, Cape Town.
Well, I mean, you know, what's interesting is you look at the statistics around what alcohol does in terms of driving violence and addictive behavior and self-harm. You know, alcohol is an incredibly dangerous drug, and yet the political economy of the whole system makes it cheap and free and culturally normalized. And when you look at our teenagers, in terms of teenagers going through all those normal rites of passage, alcohol and sometimes weed, but mostly alcohol is the drug that they are going through those rites of passage on. And completely different experience if someone goes through that using psychedelics. It's been so interesting for me in doing this podcast and trying to tell other people's stories is almost everyone I've encountered who has done one of these mushroom journeys has come away from the experience wanting to retrain as a counselor or a therapist, or, you know, in some way become part of helping to make the world a better, kind of gentler place. You know, they want to become environmentally responsible. They want to, you know, stop eating meat. They want to become a therapist to help traumatized children. I mean, it's just remarkable. A completely different response compared with alcohol.
It's very interesting that these things that grow in the earth, well, they grow on poo, actually, don't they? They
There's a lovely metaphor in that.
it is interesting. I mean, but they grow and they just pop up, and you eat them, and you get a feeling of connection.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, sure. I don't know how much I should actually go public about this, but you know, when I was a kid, I grew up in a very, very Catholic home, and you know, there was this idea that when I'm dead, there's heaven or hell, you know, and depending on the choices I make in this life, I may or may not get to see heaven, but this idea that heaven existed was a very bland, two-dimensional, unemotional,
You
just
sit
an
on a cloud,
idea.
or you sit in brimstone or
Yeah.
fire, right? Yeah.
And then as a 40-year-old or 40-something, I decide to try one of these mushroom journeys, or a few, and I sit in the space and I encounter such joy and beauty and love that I literally feel like it's the idea of heaven, but actually realized. I mean, actually made real. And I think, how is this possible that something this beautiful could actually exist and that I could experience it in this lifetime while I'm alive? I'm an atheist now, so I have this profound awareness that once my organs shut down and my brain shuts down and all my memories start to sort of dissipate, that's it. I'm over and I go back into the carbon cycle. But here now, in this world, while I'm alive, I've had the opportunity to experience the closest thing to heaven that I think is possible to have, you know? It's been remarkable.
It's very interesting.
Yeah,
It's very interesting.
it's
So
changed me.
it didn't give you a chance to connect with your, because I've heard that the experience connects your soul.
Mm.
Your
You know, I don't know. I don't know. It's difficult to use this kind of language because, you know, soul means different things to different people.
yeah.
You know, the scientists talk about how the ego dissolves when you're using psychedelics. They talk about ego dissolution. Now, I
Ego
mean, the
death.
ego.
I've heard the term ego death
Yes.
too.
Let me give you a metaphor for how to think about ego.
Mhm.
And bearing in mind, I'm not an expert, but the ego is, think about it almost as like the exoskeleton on a shellfish. It's like it's this external, almost like the persona that we put forward in order for us to interact with the world.
Mhm.
You know, you have your work persona, you have your creative writing fiction persona, you have the father of twins persona. You know, you're a military vet as well, I believe.
Yep.
So you've got all of those sort of parts of your persona that you present in different contexts, and they are necessary, and they help you to interact with the world around you, but they can also be a little bit of a barrier. Now, I don't know if you know about crayfish and lobsters and things, but you know, this is a creature that has its skeleton on the outside, and that skeleton is a very necessary protection, and it helps it interact with the world. But it's also a restrictive thing. The only way that a crayfish can grow bigger is every few months it needs to shed its exoskeleton, and then it'll sit there very vulnerable with a completely soft outside, and it'll swell itself up a little bit, and then its exoskeleton will set and become hard, and that will become its kind of external carapace, like a suit of armor for a few more months, and it'll interact with the world, and then it'll molt again, and it'll go through the same process. Now, it's almost like with psychedelics, in the few hours that you're in that psychedelic realm, it's almost like you molt and shed your exoskeleton, and it allows you just to connect with the world and expand yourself and swell and grow. And then you come out of it, and then your exoskeleton sets again, you know, but you're a little bit expanded. And so every time you do it, you expand a little bit more. There's, you know, the ego is a necessary thing, but it also cuts us off. And I mean, the interesting thing about the theory of addiction these days is that, you know, for a long time, addiction was regarded as just the result of your body becoming physically hooked on a chemical. And this goes back to an experiment where researchers would put a rat in a cage on its own, and they would give it the option of normal water and then water that was laced either with cocaine or heroin. And the rat would try both of these and eventually would get hooked on the cocaine and then cocaine water, and then just gorge itself to death. And then in the 1970s, a researcher whose name I forget decided that this was a very unrealistic experiment. He said, instead of putting the rat in the cage on its own, we're going to create this whole little world. We're going to put a whole
Oh,
family of
I've heard
rats.
this. Yeah, this is amazing.
Right.
Is this the
So
palace, the rat palace?
yeah, the rat park, yeah. So these guys, they're
Yeah.
grooming and they're having sex and they're playing and they're interacting, and so they don't touch, or they don't really use the cocaine water. And anyway, the theory that comes out of that is that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. You know, that we don't get hooked on these substances just because it's a chemical. We actually lean on them because we are trying to escape the existential pain of being disconnected and isolated and lonely. And, you know, this modern urban environment is so deceptive because we are surrounded by people, but we're not necessarily connected. And psychedelics allow people to connect with themselves, to connect with other people, and to connect with the wider sort of universe in a way that is so profoundly comforting at an existential level that it helps just soften the pain of being human.
That's very true. I mean, I'm completely clean and sober. I don't drink or do drugs or anything like that, but I've used
Mm.
in the past as far as smoking or whatever. I called it my
Mm.
lukewarm bath to get through the day. Um,
Interesting.
you
Well,
know,
I mean,
it's in terms of getting through life, I needed something just to make it a little bit more bearable. And I didn't have a
yeah,
family. I didn't have kids, and now my lukewarm bath is my children and my, you know, my family. And the
yeah,
connection that I
that's
feel towards
lovely.
the human life. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
boom.
I mean, you and I, we are part of an animal species that has evolved to be social. You know, we're
Mhm.
socially evolved
We
mammals, and
evolved because we were social. We
exactly.
evolved because we were able to be social and invent language and invent ways to manipulate our environment. You know, the horrible thing is we talk about polluting and destroying and you know, messing with the environment. I mean, we learned to cook by setting fire to acres worth of grassland and just baking the crap out of everything out there,
Mm.
destroying entire environments just to, you know, make sure there were no predators and we could watch better what was out in the dark at night. I mean, we're destructive, but we do it in a social manner.
Yeah, no, we are terribly destructive, and you know, my day job involves writing about sort of climate change and that kind of thing. And you know, when I look at the destruction that we've wrought on this planet as a species, I mean, I just shudder. You know, and yeah, and in fact, I think psychedelics might be a good way for us to just put the brakes on our excessive consumption, because um, this is the problem with the capitalist system, is that it just drives us to consume more, run from the pain of being human, and extract and exploit without thinking about the consequences. And if one becomes more sensitive to the fact that we're part of this much bigger interconnected system, and if I pull on the string here, it's going to impact on someone else over there.
Man, if you pulled a wise man from 100,000 years ago and brought him to the future, that dude would give you a high five like you would not believe, right? I mean, he would be so proud of
Oh,
you. He'd be so proud of all of us. Man, there are no saber-toothed tigers, there are no bears wandering around. I could go ahead and just chill out. And when people say, I'm going to bring back the tigers, I'm like, it's kind of, it's weird in a way because tigers are dangerous and bears are dangerous. And we've done such a great job of eliminating those dangers. I mean, they're beautiful animals. Don't get me wrong. I think that we're doing something horrible because just a couple of days ago, I walked out my door and it was disgusting out and I want to be cold. I want to be chilly. I want to wear sweaters in the fall. I want to be shoveling snow in the wintertime, but I really don't want to have to worry about bear or tigers or
yeah, no, but I think that man or woman from 100,000 years ago had a very different relationship with the lion or the bear.
he exists
They,
though in our DNA, doesn't he? I mean, he's there
so,
in us. I mean, we fear the
well,
dark because of him and what he was millions of years ago and all these DNA entanglements that exist throughout who Homo was throughout our genetic past. And we fear the dark and we want to eat sugar because of him and his ancestors. I mean, we are these people and we do
but
what we do to the world because of him.
maybe and maybe not. No, I don't think we do the things we do to the world because of him. He and she knew how to navigate the world the way you and I know how to navigate the dangers of a city highway. We know the conditions, we know the creatures operating around us, and we navigate accordingly. And yes, sometimes we get hit by a car, but mostly we don't. And I think, you know, people, you can still see it in communities living in very sort of indigenous type contexts. They know and read the natural world very, very well. They respected and loved and appreciated even the animals that were big and dangerous. What did happen when you had big kind of colonial expansion around the world is mass killing of species that is inexplicable and was not driven by the fear of predation. I mean, if you look at how the bison were killed in the US, how a lot of game in Africa were killed when the British arrived. I mean, just mountains and mountains and mountains of animals that could not have been processed and used and were not a threat, were just shot for the sake of it. That is a level of madness that I don't understand.
I heard recently that one of the reasons that we killed the bison the way that we did was lack of refrigeration. we needed the
Wow.
meat, and we couldn't savor it. We couldn't refrigerate it, so we killed as many as we possibly could. I don't know.
And then what
I don't
died?
know. I was talking
Yeah.
and I realized I don't know how it connects exactly.
No, no.
But I
Anyway,
mean, yeah, we're horrible when we get together. We're absolutely horrible. We poison, and we're doing it again, and it's really, really sad.
so
And
can
we
I bring
don't.
this? Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm
Sorry,
sorry.
no, I'm just thinking like how we can connect the dots here, because we're kind of living in a world where a lot
I
of the
think we can connect the dots to the 1970s when we started doing these drugs, and we were getting it together again. We were going, hey, let's do a better job, people. No, we're going to make these drugs illegal so that we can't really connect anymore. We can't form a community. And we stopped doing it. And we started to pollute the crap out of the environment. And we started to say, we're going to be enemies and hate each other, and we're going to continue wars. We've been at war constantly since, the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think that from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we had strong colonial movement around the planet. We had machines that allowed us to move a hell of a lot more efficiently. We had a capitalist system gaining traction everywhere, which allowed for incredible amassing of wealth and greed and extraction of weaker parties as a result. And I think that kicked into gear a machine that is so strong and powerful now. And now, I mean, just climate change is an example of how all of that is now coming home to roost. 300 years of emissions catching up on us, and oh boy. But I think that it does look as though the capitalist system is beginning to falter, and we are needing to find different ways of relating to one another where we aren't all just commodified units of labor. And I think that a system
Because
where we value
it's now or not. I mean, we're going to be AI'd, aren't we? I mean, we're going to be replaced by robots, and they're going to be doing the labor for us, digging and manufacturing, and either we're going to wither and die, and the millionaires are going to be rich in their little sky castles, and I don't know what's going to happen at that point. The human race is going
sorry, the human race is going to
just basically be billionaires. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do, conduct wars with robots on the ground. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of bored people around, and they might want to do that. Look, I think the situation in the developing world is very different. I think we're a long way from that. But
you do see the world differently, though. When you look out your window, or when you watch the news at night, I mean, I speak from a world that we keep our poor in towers, and they're really not that. They're bad off, obviously, but your poor are kept in really horrible conditions, right? I mean,
yeah, the level of poverty and inequality in this country is off the charts compared with, I think, what you've experienced. And I mean, this is the tragedy, is that for most people born into this country, they're born into a context where their levels of deprivation that are, I mean, you just don't overcome that overnight.
on a continent too. I mean, we're talking about South Africa, but then we expand north, and we're talking like horrid conditions. I mean, nightmarish conditions. I mean, women start to get treated like almost animalistically, right? I mean, it's just.
Well, there are. Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't think one can make blanket statements like that. But there are some communities where because of the sort of patriarchal norms, women are really underdeveloped and most vulnerable in some communities. But yeah, I don't know. I think we're straying a little bit away from where I feel more comfortable talking about in this context, because I'm concerned with how how these substances could be used to just make life less painful for people, and how one introduces it in a context where culturally psychedelics haven't been experimented with. And
Do you think that these substances could change the human race for the better? I guess is the question that
look, I
we're
think what
striving.
yeah, okay. So what got everyone into trouble in the 1960s was Timothy Leary. And the idea, and I mean, he basically was saying something like that, let's just put a whole lot of acid in the water and we'll change the world. It's not a good
And we,
idea.
we did start this conversation with saying we don't like acid, we like mushrooms, and we like ayahuasca.
But
So let's
I
go
do
back
think,
to that question and say why don't we like acid? And why do we
okay,
like
so,
mushrooms and ayahuasca?
all right. Okay. So just quickly to kind of round off the Timothy Leary thought is that people who've experimented with psychedelics realize how potent they are as a way of self-actualizing people and transforming people for the better, if it's part of a broader sort of journey to improve oneself. So yes, I think if psychedelics were used widely and responsibly, they would have a very powerful effect at helping communities become more functional. I really,
Mhm.
really do. I think people would work, they'd be more kind towards one another, more caring, more loving, more responsible to one another. Certainly take alcohol out the
Oh
picture.
yeah, I agree.
But
Alcohol's a horrible drug. What is unwisely and responsibly
wisely and
to you?
responsibly, you know, um, people who use psychedelics talk about set and setting. It's not like a drug that you sit down around a barbecue fire with your mates and you throw back a few glasses and you get hammered. Um, the intensity of the experience is such that you want to be in a safe, calm place. You want to be surrounded by people who are in a similar state as you. And obviously, it depends how much you take. So if you go to a rock concert and everyone else is drinking alcohol and getting sort of loud and aggressive and obnoxious, that's the
That's not the
last
time to
thing.
do it. Yeah.
No, it's not the time for
It
it.
sounds so
And
horrible. I don't.
and certainly if you're taking bigger doses where you're having these much deeper experiences, you want to be very safe. You don't want to have to deal with water or food issues. You don't want to find yourself cold and having to problem solve and get clothes to warm yourself up. And often, particularly for a more intense trip, you really want to have someone with you who is sober, or has only had a tiny amount of the substance, so that they can just tend to you. It's a very, very different experience. It's you do a lot of internal work. You go on these incredible sort of thought processes, and sometimes it can become a little bit intense and overwhelming. They invariably, people say that these are profound transforming experiences, not always comfortable ones. And that's what I try and do. Oh, in fact, let me just touch on this for a second.
Sure.
Um, the fascinating thing about the science around psychedelic therapy is it's showing that compared with, say, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, these are substances that you have to keep the substance in your body constantly in order for it to work, and it doesn't always work. But it means, for instance, if you take an antidepressant, you have to take a pill every day. Um, and the same with anti-anxiety meds, etc. What happens with psychedelics is that it's the subjective experience you have while you're in that deep psychedelic state that brings about these positive mood and behavior changes that last for months after the substance has left your body. So, I mean, this is why it's so profound. Two or three psychedelic experiences, medically, that's a small amount of money to pay for the substance for those 3 sessions. And you could find yourself sort of a year later and you're still not craving booze, or you're still not showing signs of depression. And people with treatment resistant depression and treatment resistant PTSD have come away from some of the clinical trials, and they are symptom free months later. So what explains this? So what appears to happen is that it's the subjective experience you have in that deep psychedelic state which allows you to transform yourself. So, for instance, if you go to years and years of psychotherapy, you will talk through your own life in a way that you will use certain stories guided by your therapist to help you make meaning and sense of yourself and where you fit into the world. And the psychedelic experience allows you to get the same kinds of insights, but almost like in a matter of hours. I mean, it's remarkable. People come away from these ayahuasca and mushroom journeys, and they say it feels like they've had, 6 years of therapy in a night. So what I've tried to do with my podcast is not to just talk about the sort of dry facts and figures of the science around psychedelic therapy. I've tried to show people's individual stories, to show how they have been informed by the psychedelic trips, to illustrate to the listener how the substance actually works.
What do you think is going to happen with the 73-year-old woman?
Oh, yes. Okay. So the interesting thing, thank you for coming back to that. So Monica was arrested and charged with possession and dealing. And this is a charge that could come with a 15-year jail term. So
it's the end of her life, basically. That's the rest of her existence. Yeah.
So now her name is Monica Kromhout. So what she has done is she's approached the court and said she is going to challenge the constitutionality of the law as it stands. And she says she maintains that the substance is not dangerous and addictive, and that it actually has huge medical and spiritual potential. And that on the basis of that, it should be the right of every South African, according to our Bill of Rights, our Constitution, that we should have access to this substance. So on the basis of that, she was given a stay of prosecution, and her legal team is putting together a court application that will be initiated in 2018, in which she will bring medical experts from the US and the UK. They will present all of the latest science around the medical potential of psilocybin, and then they will ask the court to review the laws, and then hopefully psilocybin will be removed from the Schedule 7 listing according to the Drugs Act, and will be either decriminalized or legalized. And if that happens, then Parliament will ask the lawmakers to just put a set of regulations in place that will allow for the safe growing and distribution, sale, and then use of the substance. And if that happens, then therapists can start introducing psychedelic therapy into the therapy realm. And I mean, it's very, very simple. They take the existing experience. They would get a little bit of extra training around how to hold a psychedelic process, and then they could implement it quite easily. And I mean, it's interesting listening to the guys from Johns Hopkins Medical School. They say it's a matter of when psilocybin becomes medicine, not if, when. And you'll probably remember from your own newspaper headlines, your FDA recently announced that MDMA, which most people know as ecstasy on the street, MDMA, they said was a breakthrough medical technology.
For PTSD, I'm not yeah. The VA's using it in various hospital systems around the country. I think Washington for one.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know what that declaration means in terms of the policy implications, but if the FDA is happy to regard MDMA as a breakthrough medical technology, that means they are getting ready to license it medically, and it looks as though that will happen within 5 years. So if those kinds of changes are happening in the States, and it will happen in Europe, no doubt it will happen here eventually. But we've got lots of other lots of other pressing issues. Our politicians are very conservative about this, so we have to just hope that that the court case works out well, and I really hope it does, because the South Africans need access to this kind of treatment.
Yeah. And do you think that'll change things across the board, or do you think that's just one-stop shopping?
What do you mean change across the board?
Do you think that'll open the floodgates for other changes in South Africa? Do you think that's just one? Well, I mean, do you think that'll make any difference in terms of the racial tensions, or, well, I mean, I guess in terms of therapy, maybe that'll open some minds, or I don't know. What do you think that'll do for South Africa?
I think what the legalizing of psilocybin will do is that it'll allow for one small medical intervention in a country that needs a lot of development on the medical front. And I'm hoping what this podcast will do is help people realize. So, I mean, just think for a minute what penicillin meant for us when it was discovered as an antibiotic a century ago. Consider what birth control meant for women who suddenly now could have agency over their bodies and could have agency over their educational potential and their job prospects, because now they could decide when they wanted to have kids and how many kids they wanted to have. Think about other medical breakthroughs, like the idea that soon we should be able to have spray-on skin made from our own stem cells, and what that means for burn victims who now no longer wouldn't have to go through painful skin graft processes. These are all medical breakthrough technologies that have significant development potential, and just good water and sanitation has a big development potential, and to get mental health support and treatment for communities that are profoundly traumatized, it will just make their lives less hard, less painful. There are still masses of other interventions that are needed. You need better education, better nutrition, better policing, all sorts of other things. This isn't a silver bullet, but it just might take the edge off for some individuals.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a fantastic subject, and I wish her all. Do you think she has a chance?
I am incredibly optimistic. The Professor David Nutt, who's a neuropsychopharmacologist from Imperial College London, extremely well versed in the science, very good on the witness stand. He is going to be coming out to testify at this court case and is assisting her team with putting together a strong evidence-based report to show the judge all the latest evidence about how effective this therapy is. And hopefully we will get a progressive judge. We had an unfortunate situation in a few months ago where a couple was in court also trying, in this case, to get cannabis legalized on the basis that we have a constitutional right to access, again, a potential medical therapy, because cannabis has lots of medical potential. And Professor Nutt was flown out for that, and also a doctor from the US who's very well versed in the subject matter and whose name I now forget. But the state and a very conservative Christian Doctors for Life organization, they teamed up and basically used delay tactics to stop the US expert from testifying for a period of a whole week. And eventually his flight was back, he had to head back to the US because his ticket was booked for the Sunday, and there was no money to pay for him to stay longer and get him a new ticket, because, this couple had spent a small fortune just getting the whole court process going. That was just dirty tricks from the state and Doctors for Life. And I really hope that they don't try something similar in this case. Fortunately,
what benefit do they have doing something like that? I mean, I just don't understand why it helps so much. I mean, just the oils from the plant help. Well, many medical conditions.
Well, people get caught up in all sorts of ideological positions. I mean, this is a group that lobbies against termination of pregnancies, for instance, So
which means disallowing women to choose
completely,
what they're going to do with their body. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense taking away free will. Just ruining the idea of you're now a slave to my ideals. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's
you have doing that. I just don't get it. I don't get it.
Yeah, no, I don't either, and I get exasperated when I'm confronted with that way of thinking. But yeah, let's hope that something similar doesn't happen in the psilocybin trial.
What are your I know we kind of got sidetracked. Do you remember which direction we were going in before I mentioned your
Oh, we were going to talk about the difference between LSD and psilocybin.
Oh, please, I'd like to mention that, because I know we're getting close to that hour point. You do not like LSD as a psychedelic.
I don't, but it's also probably because of I didn't, when I had a negative experience on it, it was because I had the set and setting all wrong. And I would encourage listeners, if they want to learn more about this, to go off to episode 5 of my podcast, which is actually it's a departure from the normal storytelling. It actually is a Q&A, but it's with someone who explains set and setting very well. The first 2 or 3 times I tried LSD, it was fantastic. It was with a group of very close friends in a very safe, beautiful environment. It was wonderful. I remember looking at kind of seething wood fibers, thinking I'm looking at the molecular structure of the universe. But then the next few times I took it, I was largely on my own and had incredibly bad anxiety responses. Very bad move. And when I think about it, it was like...
Yeah, that was my reaction. All 3 times I've done it, it's just really bad anxiety responses.
Okay. And you were on your own, hey?
No, the first time I was really young. I should not have probably done it. I was like 15 years old. But I almost got into a fight with somebody. I was like sophomore in high school or something. Almost got into a fight, and then I had a really bad reaction where I thought I was my brother. I don't know. And then the second time I thought I had really bad issues with my sister too. So all of my bad reactions are with my family. And one of her friends tried to take her car, and I just, no, don't take my sister's car. It's like, there's really bad issues with my family. But yeah.
I think you had set and setting all wrong. And you might have been a bit young. I mean, many of the people I've spoken to for this podcast are grateful that they've discovered psychedelics in the sort of midlife, in their 40s, when they're older, more mature, able to cope. Anyway, so yeah, with the LSD, it was literally like, you know, the idea of sharpening a blade on a whetstone. For me, my negative experiences on acid felt literally like taking a blade and sharpening it against a stone. But that was because I got the setting wrong. I was in the wrong context. But when I tried these mushroom journeys, what was interesting for me is that once I'd taken the substance, I suddenly had this incredible anxiety, and I thought, oh God, what have I done? You know, and I felt this huge ball of anxiety in my chest. And yet it felt as though, I mean, this was the imagery that I had as I sat with it. It felt as though the mushrooms were moving through the anxiety, almost like turning it into a pumice stone and making it porous and airy. So instead of sharpening the anxiety, that it was actually rounding off the edges of the stone and making it breathe and making it more manageable. And once I realized that was how psilocybin was working with me rather than against me on the anxiety just disappeared. And when I went through that experience, I thought, okay, I can trust this. I can trust this process. And since then, I've never had an anxiety response on mushrooms. As I said, I've done a couple of these journeys and had a couple of sort of intense, I've only done one 5-gram journey, but I've had a couple of other pretty intense experiences, and they've all been absolutely wondrous and magical. I've never had an anxiety response on them. So what my intense mushroom journey was very intense. I mean, the process I went through was painful, but I came out on the other side feeling like a newborn. It was amazing.
Interesting. So a painful trip.
Emotionally painful.
Emotionally.
Yeah, and a lot of people talk about that. They don't talk about bad trips. They talk about difficult trips. So they deal with difficult stuff. It's uncomfortable, but they feel absolutely equipped to deal with it. And they come away from it saying, this was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life.
Do you remember during what was actually painful to you, or does it kind of, oh, something was going on? I don't remember what exactly, but man, do I feel like that was cathartic.
Yeah, I remember it very clearly. Now, this is the interesting thing, you know, I think because I am by nature a word person, I like to make sense of my world through stories. So for me, the whole thing became a very clear storyline. So I was able to articulate very clearly what happened in the process. But for many other people who I've spoken to, and I've tried to sort of extract their own experiences from them, for those people who aren't word people, who aren't good at articulating their internal landscape, they just look at me and shake their head and say, I don't have words for it. It was amazing. It was incredible. It was powerful. It was hard. It was transformative, but I can't tell you what happened. So it really depends. Different people have different ways of processing their internal stuff, their internal landscapes, and some people do it verbally the way I do, and some people don't.
I wonder if those are the type of people that have more fun on it, because it just goes in one ear and out the other. It's more like a party experience where they don't have to actually dwell on it when it's over with.
No, that's not what's happening at all. I think anyone going into a deep psychedelic trip like that is not going into it recreationally at all. And yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, it's like some people have got curly hair, some people have got long, straight blonde hair. You know, that's got nothing to do with it. It's just how different people's brains work in different ways. And, you know, if you aren't able to articulate your story verbally very well, it doesn't mean that you're not engaged completely with that story. You absolutely are. You just process it at a different level.
Have you ever been to South Africa? Not South. Sorry, South America or Peru, and done one of the authentic ceremonial with the medicine men?
I've been to Peru, but not for an ayahuasca retreat, and I would. I mean, I would be interested to try it. I went to Peru a few years ago to cover the United Nations Climate Conference, which I think happened in, was it 2010? No, sorry, it was 2014. Sorry, so I was there for work, but I didn't try ayahuasca. I haven't tried ayahuasca, and I must say I'm a little bit nervous of it because I think it's a lot more difficult than mushrooms.
Yeah. Oh, you've never done it. You've never done it.
No, I haven't. So there are a couple of hallucinogens that are used in these ceremonial ways. There's another one called ibogaine, which incidentally comes from West Africa.
That's really quick. Like, boom, it's over with, like a few minutes.
No, you're thinking of DMT.
Oh, okay.
So DMT is literally a 5-minute trip. Ibogaine can be, I think, 12 hours, but it's very intense. But the interesting thing is ibogaine, okay, so this comes from a tree in West Africa. It is being used very effectively for treating opioid addiction.
Okay, that's what I'm about. All right.
Yeah. So I mean, that's
was a really effective treatment for heroin and abusers and opioid addictions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's ibogaine.
I think that's cruel to have that out there and not have that being used in a clinical setting.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there was a petition going around in the UK recently, sent by doctors and therapists working in the therapeutic community, calling for the government in the UK to legalize psilocybin. And the argument basically is that it's inhumane and it's unethical to withhold from people who are suffering a substance that can have such profound life-changing potential for them.
I agree. My God, that's just horrible. You know how they say there's been no overdoses or deaths on weed? You know, that thing that has been said for decades. Whether it's true or not, I've never done any research. I don't know if anybody's ever died on weed. Has there ever been any deaths on any of these psychedelics, like overdoses or whatever?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it looks like it's not really possible to overdose on psychedelics because they work in the body so differently. So you can overdose on alcohol. You know, you can literally drink yourself so that you're so toxic that your organs shut down. You can kill yourself.
I just found out from my doctor you can kill yourself on vitamin D too. I've been taking too much of it. He told me to stop.
Oh boy. Whoops. You know, with heroin, if you get the dose wrong, your breathing shuts down and you basically suffocate. So psychedelics, you can't overdose at that level. The only thing that can happen is if you have a traumatic psychedelic experience, you might, you know, run out and harm yourself, you know, kind of run into the traffic and accidentally get hit by a car. That's why, you know, that's where the harm lies. But, you know, there are very, very few deaths associated with psychedelics. And even where they are, it's not clear whether that was the only substance in the person's body. There's a very interesting study that comes out of Scotland, and I forget which research institution. I'm sorry, I don't have it at my fingertips. But it was doing an analysis in the UK of newspaper reports that were covering deaths associated with different drugs. And they invariably, the journalists radically overplayed deaths associated with psychedelics and MDMA, for instance, whereas they underplayed deaths associated with alcohol. So and even
It's so dumb.
yeah. Well, you know, it's the typical sort of journalistic principle of let's go and find something that's sensational and interesting that's going to sell newspapers.
Yeah,
But unfortunately, and it's been fed by this cultural myth that
yeah.
these drugs are so dangerous. And I mean, you know, there's a lot of evidence now of how Nixon and the CIA deliberately manufactured this moral panic. And a lot of these attitudes around the supposed dangers and harms of these substances, you can link them back to the myths that were created by Nixon and the CIA.
All to keep the military-industrial complex going strong.
Absolutely, hey, isn't that tragic?
It is, because
Yeah,
it's the death of people versus the life of people.
yeah, for
The
profit.
I mean, honestly, to keep the police strong and to keep the races segregated and
Mm.
the prisons stocked up and full and
Mm.
unions, it's really sickening.
Did
What a
you
world,
understand? Can I ask you a question?
please.
Did you understand the military and the idea of the military industrial complex before you signed up?
I was in high school. I was 17, my junior year, summer of. I didn't know crap.
Yeah.
I went 3 days after I graduated high school. I still didn't know crap. I didn't get a fuller picture until I was in my 20s. I was 20 years old, and I just kind of had this all of a sudden blam moment where I realized how small I was as a private, just tiny little cog being bossed around by an E5 sergeant who's being bossed around by an E6 who is being bossed around by a lieutenant who is being bossed around by somebody else, all the way up to the president. I mean, I'm just this tiny little insignificant bullet catcher, and that's been how I viewed the military ever since. All the
Yeah.
money being funneled into it and the trillions of dollars that they spend on tanks and trucks, and it's like, oh my God. I mean, I was
Mm.
stationed on a post with 60,000 people that were going to be shoved in front of enemies in moments notice. I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the 101st Airborne Division, and what they called my unit was the speed bump, which means that we could be sent anywhere within 72 hours. It's like we weren't made to survive. We were made to slow down the enemy just enough
Yeah.
so
And
they
get
can send in
annihilated in the process.
and get annihilated. And we didn't mean anything. I mean, we had esprit de corps. You know what I mean? We had, we had a song, we had a flag, we had unit patches, we had Old Abe, we had aerosol patches and all that good stuff, but we weren't really meant to survive. And that was what really got
Yeah.
to me one day. I was like, man, we were nothing.
Yeah. And I think that's
I
how the
started
war
smoking
machine.
weed. I was like,
Yeah.
I do not matter.
Yeah. So I
I am
think that
fodder here.
yeah, that's why that's how the military machine has survived for so long, is taking particularly young men who it's changing now, women as well, but young men who haven't had a chance to grow up and learn and think, and using that naivete as a way to recruit the blunt force guys at the bottom of the pecking order. It's just terrible. The episode 4 in my podcast visits. It tells the story of a man who now is approaching his mid-50s, but who had a similar realization. A South African man who was basically recruited by what essentially was a white supremacist kind of army. That's what the South African army was at the time. And he was sent off to fight on our border against what he was told was Africa's apartheid state trying to reach its hold across into its neighboring country. And this young man, I mean, he was 17 at the time, and when I look at pictures of him, he looked like he wasn't a day over 15. He looked like a kid. And him and his corps were, sent out to do the most terrible things to people. And he had to watch his commanding officer torturing and brutalizing young men who were supposedly captured enemies and were just ordinary, farmers. And eventually, by the end of it, he just couldn't stand it anymore. And he walked over to his commanding officer and he said, "Here's my rifle. I'm not doing this anymore. You can, he was going to get court-martialed, or that he suspected he was going to get court-martialed. Anyway, it's a very long story, but but yeah, you know, the trauma of a young, a 17-year-old man who knows very little about the world and is recruited into a machine like that, that bullies him and expects him to behave in a certain way. And then suddenly, as you experience, and are confronted with this horror.
My first novel is about a Nigerian child soldier, you know, grows up in an apocalyptic world where he is forced to fend for himself at the, you know, bottom of a group of boys, you know, bottom, you know, feeding from the trash and working his way up. And eventually, over the course of his, you know, 15 years, 17 years of existence, he works his way to the top, murdering and doing horrible, horrible things. And, you know, he escapes, becomes a drug dealer and becomes an enforcer and blah, blah, blah. Eventually, you know, he's an older man looking back on his life, and he's done horrible things to survive. He's a character, you know, it's a bigger story than that, but he's one of the people. He was one of my favorite characters in that story just because of where he's come from. It's not just about, you know, the bigger militaries with, you know, flags. It's about these little groups of people too that call themselves soldiers. I mean, mafias, gangs. I mean, they're all
over the world, hey?
They take younger men because younger men are stupid, and they've got these hormones floating around in their bodies that make them feel invincible. We're an interesting species as humans. We're interesting for some reason.
We definitely are.
Yeah. So where are we at in terms of psychedelics?
I don't know. We've gone all over the place.
That's me.
No, it's been.
That's how I handle these podcasts. I write notes as I go along. Let me ask you, Leonie, right, is how you say your name?
That's
And
correct.
Joubert.
Yeah.
Joubert. It's a beautiful name. You are a wonderful conversationalist. I think your podcast is Psychonaut.
Yes.
Right?
That's
Where
right.
else?
So you can find it on iTunes. Just look for the Psychonauts. If you don't have the, you won't find it. Or else you can also listen to it directly from the website, which is psychonauts.co.za. And also, I mean, if you struggle to find me, just Google Leonie Joubert, science writer, and that generally comes up with a hit. There are not many science writers in South Africa, so.
Oh, really?
No, not many at all. And in fact, it's interesting. The reason why I decided to do this story as a podcast, you know, in South Africa, it's very, very difficult to sell books. We have a population of about 53 million now. And in order to get a best-selling nonfiction book here, you only have to sell 5,000 copies of a book. That's how limited our market is. And I figured that this story was just too important to be limited by that. So I thought I'd try podcasting and see if it can get wider traction.
How are you doing?
It's not doing too badly. It's picking up. I mean, I don't even know what to compare it to, because I don't know what South African podcast figures are like, and I don't know what reach it's now going to get overseas. But there seems to be more and more interest, and Twitter helps. Social media definitely helps. Yeah, I also haven't figured out how to track numbers through iTunes.
What you're supposed to do is look at your website, because I think that's where your numbers are.
Okay, all right. Okay,
That's
I'll
where
do that.
that's where iTunes that's where you're downloading your episode from. Because that's all your numbers are.
Okay, and tell me, how's yours done? I mean, I guess my question is this: how do you measure success of a podcast?
I measure this by the number of conversations I can get.
Okay.
I look at it as in, can I get somebody to talk to me for an hour? And how good is the conversation? Because I love it. I love being able to talk to people about creativity and you know, what they're doing and what's happening. I mean, I'm new too. I've only been doing this for about 3 months, and I'm hoping to keep doing it. And you know, for a year, I'm looking at it a year. It looks like a year is about the time frame where things start to kick off. Consistency is, you know, key for something like this. And the
Yeah.
longer you can do it, the better off things are going to be for you in the long run.
Okay.
The success rate for people like Joe Rogan or like a Nerdist, I mean, they've been doing this for like almost a decade now. You know, they've got thousands of podcasts, and this is the future. You know, it's not going to be starting a radio station. It's not going to be starting a TV station. It's going to be doing something like this and being good at it. So
Yeah.
don't be discouraged.
Well, thank you. It's been very interesting chatting with you, and I wish you all the very best with your own podcast. I hope it does incredibly well.
Hey, I really appreciate you doing this with me. Is there any place else that we can find you?
In what sense? Just online, or
Yeah.
you know, a lot of my stuff is online. You know, through my website is just leoniejoubert.co.za. I have a portfolio of all of my work up there. And interestingly, I'm now beginning to think that some of the previous work that I've done, I might decide to record it and publish it in an audio form, just, you know, for the hell of it, because it's quite fun to read one's own work and put it out there.
Oh, and there's one other question I wanted to ask you. What connection do you have to the Museum of Mirrors?
Museum of Mirrors. I've never heard of that.
They are a oh God, man, I'm gonna mess this up. That's how I found you, actually.
Oh,
I was
really? Museum of
yeah,
Mirrors.
I listened to they are an interesting couple. I'm gonna look them up so I don't
Yeah.
mess up their names. You might actually want to look them up too. They're upstate New York a little bit by Poughkeepsie. Museum of Mirrors, and they were on another podcast by a comedian through the oh God, I'm not gonna be able to find this. You know what? I'm gonna send you a link when I actually do find it. But I follow them on Twitter, and they're a group of guys, a woman and a man. They're not married. They just have a cohabitation thing since like the 1970s. But they're big into psychedelics. They are artists themselves. They do sculpture and paintings, and they have just this huge following. And they've made this museum in upstate New York, and basically, you know, they have built this kind of sculpture garden, and they're just interesting guys. I don't know if you'd want to do an episode on them. I would love to talk to them, but I was intimidated to ask, and I found you connected to them probably because of the psychedelic nature of your work. And does it ring a bell?
It doesn't, but I'm going to go and look for them now and make contact.
Yeah, I'm going to see if I can find you some information. If you don't find them yourself, I will send you some information for the end of the day. But that's how I found you, and that's why I followed you, and I sent you a message, and you know, now it's history. But
well, thank you so much for making contact. I can't tell you how lovely it is. You know, I feel like I'm a little bit of a lost out of space here. You know, doing this in a very isolated context. So, you know, to have someone from, you're in New York, eh?
yeah.
To have someone from New York to make contact is really special. So thanks very much.
Yeah, not a problem. Well, I mean, I don't look at it like that. I mean, it was amazing talking with you. You're a very articulate and fun individual. And
thanks so much. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, you too. Have a great one.
Thank you. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.